Alright guys, today I'm changing valve cover gaskets and spark plugs on my 2006 Toyota Land Cruiser. I'll share all of the tools, torque specs, and notes that I had along the way, and I hope you find this video helpful. Let's get started on the job. First, I'm removing the airbox. There are two 10mm bolts to remove here. Then I'll loosen the four clasps over the air filter, remove the harness on the mass airflow sensor. We have a few ventilation hoses to remove as well. Once those are off, you can loosen the clasp here, get a little leverage, and that airbox will come right off. Now I'm removing the ventilation hose. I'm just using a small hook to slide underneath and help slide that off. Now I'll remove the connector on each of the four ignition coils. I had trouble taking these off by hand, so I just used my hook here to slide it underneath the clip. That made taking it off a lot easier. Just be careful not to break the end of the clip if you do that. Now I'm removing the four bolts on the ignition coil. The torque spec for this is 66 inch-pounds. Now I removed each of the coils and set those on top of the engine. There's just one more connector to remove here, again using that hook. Now I'm doing a little bit of cleanup around the top of the valve cover just to make sure there aren't any big pieces of debris that fall in as I remove the valve cover. There are 9 10mm bolts that secure the valve cover. The torque spec is 53 inch-pounds on those. Something that was really surprising on this job is how loose a couple of those bolts were. They're so loose I probably could have just taken it out by hand. I guess it makes sense since I did have a little bit of an oil leak coming from the valve cover gasket. It was just surprising to find such a loose bolt there. My valve cover was pretty hard to pull away from the block, so I was looking for a place where I could apply a little bit of leverage just to help remove that. I found a good spot right here. I would just say if you're having this problem as well, be cautious that you're not kind of scratching the aluminum there and creating a place for oil to leak out in the future. I'm actually being pretty delicate here, and I'm just turning left and right to create a little bit of a gap so that I can remove the valve cover. You can hear that breaking away, and now I was able to get leverage along the top and pull the valve cover off. I grabbed it in a few spots just to loosen everything up, and I think it's very likely when you finally pull this off that the old gasket is going to be stuck against the block there, especially if this is the first time you've ever changed the gasket. It's had a lot of time to kind of turn almost into a hard plastic and get stuck against the metal there. After setting the valve cover off to the side, I started doing a few passes cleaning off this surface. I was just using a little bit of degreaser that's safe for aluminum, and I'd spray a little bit on the rag and just go around this surface here. This is how I actually spotted the leak. Where I'm cleaning right here, I could see some oil accumulating, and then going to the forums, I realized, oh, it's probably the valve cover gasket, and yeah, there's definitely progressively more oil accumulating here. It's an easy way to check and see if you might need to change your valve cover gaskets. After getting that cleaned up, now I'm moving on to removing the old seal packing. There are a couple places where you'll need to scrape this away. I'm just using my hook here to help pry that off and avoid getting it down into the valves. The seal packing is essentially just a heat-resistant rubber, and it's applied in these locations because there are these sharp edges, and those are places where some of the oil can sneak by the seal. So it's helpful to note where this was applied previously, and I'll go through that when I'm reinstalling the new valve covers as well. And here's the other location where you'll find some seal packing. Again, just scraping that off with this hook. Actually found the hook to be really useful in this job because there are a few tight spaces. You'll see in just a second when we're removing the half moons. This is also useful in scraping some of the seal packing off. So once you have all the larger chunks removed, definitely go back through this area with the degreaser. Make sure you remove all of the oil and any of the old seal packing before reinstalling the valve covers. Now moving on to the half moons. This is another source of a potential oil leak over time as this seal packing starts to degrade. I just used a pair of pliers to pull each of those out, and then again, just like we did before, removing some of the seal packing that's left behind. One note for you on these, I found the half moons to be a little bit stubborn. The seal packing is coated all along the inside of it, so it's actually stuck in there pretty well. But just keep pulling on it and eventually they'll come right out. And I'm removing the seal packing that was left behind. I grabbed a pair of tweezers just because it's kind of a far reach towards the back of the engine. I don't know how critical it is to avoid getting the seal packing down into this area. Just didn't feel like a good idea to me, so I was trying to be as cautious as possible in removing that stuff. I'm just doing a light cleaning here, but again, you want to make sure that this surface is completely free of oil and any of the old seal packing before we do the reinstall. And with that out of the way, now I'll move on to installing the new gaskets. First, here's a look at the old ones, just to give you a sense of how these looked after 220,000 miles. So they basically turned into plastic, they're cracking, compared to the new ones, which feel like a soft rubber. To remove the spark plug seals, I'm just using this seal puller, screwdriver, and hammer. And if you follow this procedure that I'm doing right here, will make removing these spark plug gaskets really easy. So you just want to take your screwdriver, put it underneath the metal tab, and pry it up. Each of the seals has 4 tabs. I would recommend just bending all of those up and out of the way. The metal is pretty pliable, doesn't take too much effort, and it makes removing the seal quite a bit easier. With the metal tabs out of the way, now I wedge my screwdriver in between the seal and the valve cover, and I'm just twisting left and right to create a little bit of space, and then using this seal puller to remove it the rest of the way. The seal puller is definitely not required to get these out. I think the screwdriver would work just fine. I happen to have one of these from another project, and it did help make things just a little bit easier. So now I'm removing the remaining 3 spark plug seals, and once those are out, now I'll start cleaning things up and get ready to install all the new gaskets. The inside of my valve cover wasn't actually too dirty. I've seen some videos with oil really caked on. In that case, I think you'd want to use a wire brush of some sort. My primary focus was where the new gasket is going to seat against this and where those spark plug gaskets will go as well. So just making sure that was all free of oil. And the same idea on the half moons, making sure all the old seal packing is removed, that they're free of oil. I didn't have a wire brush, so I was just scraping some of that off, hit it with the degreaser, and then using a towel to make sure it was all cleaned up and ready to go. And now I'm reinstalling the spark plug seals. I just used a little bit of motor oil to coat the outside of that, get it seated, and then you'll be able to easily tap that back into place. And you can see that the seal is flush with the inside of the valve cover. It actually doesn't rest against the inner part, so you can see that little gap is remaining right there. I'll go ahead and reinstall those in the remaining 3. Same thing, little motor oil, get it seated, and then tap those into place. And the last step on these, I'll flatten the metal tabs to secure the spark plug seals back in place. And with that wrapped up, now the new gasket is ready to be installed on the valve cover. The trick with this is you don't want to push along the gasket. You want to kind of get it situated and then push it straight down against the valve cover. And that just helps to avoid having the gasket bunch up and then having to start over. The valve cover gasket has a small lip, so that helps it stay seated against the valve cover, and you'll feel when that locks into place. The last step before reinstalling the valve cover is applying seal packing. So this diagram from Toyota shows where we need to apply this. You have the 4 arrows on the right, and that's being applied to the half moons. I'll show you that in just a second, and 2 more areas along the front. I dropped in this note from the FSM calling out that all the oil needs to be removed. As I've mentioned, you have 5 minutes to reinstall the valve cover after you've applied the seal packing, and you should wait for 2 hours before starting the engine once you're done with this job. I started with the half moons first, and my approach was to follow that center rib and just put a healthy bead of seal packing along that. I was trying to replicate in terms of quantity what I saw from the half moons that I removed. I couldn't find a good video on the quantity to apply here, so I'm just using my best judgment. And then you'll see as I'm applying this, you have just a bit oozing out, which I think is a good thing. And then the remaining, I just flattened out across the top of the half moon. And moving on to the second one, following the same procedure and applying a bead of the seal packing along the inner rib. Once that's done, go ahead and seat that into place. You'll find that they're going to want to move left and right, of course, because the seal packing is slippery. Just try to make that as even as possible, and you want to make sure that those gaps along the top have seal packing on them. So that's what I'm doing right here, is just trying to kind of use any excess that was coming out to create the seal along the top of the half moon. And you can apply a little bit more if you need to. I felt like I had enough of the seal packing to create a good seal on that. So moving on to our next 2 points, applying along this sharp edge here. I think in this case the camera is kind of adding 10 pounds. It looks like I'm applying quite a bit, but I don't actually think you need a ton to create a good seal. You just want to make sure you have good coverage over those sharp turns, and that's what's going to create a good seal and prevent any leakage. After applying the seal packing, then I just smoothed that out along the bottom and top. And now I'll go ahead and grab the valve cover and slide that into place. Nothing too special here. I just made sure to have all the wiring and hoses out of the way and position the valve cover over each of those spark plug seals. You might notice once you have it positioned and set on to the block that it doesn't feel like it's quite seated properly. So of course you want to make sure that your gasket is fully on the valve cover and aligned, but also the new gasket is a lot bigger than the previous one because it hasn't been compressed. So it's going to feel like it's misaligned. So check it, but it's also normal for it to feel like it's kind of sticking out a bit. I made a first pass tightening all the bolts by hand first, and then Toyota recommends uniformly tightening the bolts. Most people say follow kind of a star pattern to tighten them, and so that's what I did with the torque wrench. I did this in probably 3 to 5 passes before they were able to be torqued down to their spec. One more time, the spec is 53 inch-pounds. One other recommendation on this, I think it's really good to have a variety of extensions for your torque wrench or ratchet, as well as something that can articulate. There are a lot of kind of weird angles here, and you can see, like, for example, that metal hose, the AC line coming out right there was kind of hard to work around. It's even worse on the driver's side. When you tackle that, have those handy. It will really save you a lot of headache. And if you have any need to change the spark plugs, now is definitely the time to do that. So let me run through this really quick. I'm using a 5/8 inch spark plug removal tool. This one happens to articulate a little bit back and forth, helps with some of the weird angles that you might run into. And then there's a magnet on the inside, so it's what makes it special and easier to pull the spark plug out. The torque spec for the spark plugs is 13 foot-pounds. And I just used the OEM ones from Toyota. I found a good price for those online, so just picked up 8 of them. Here's a quick look at the old one. You can see some of the carbon buildup there. Wasn't having any particular issues with the ones that the previous owner installed, and I probably had maybe 5,000 miles left, but again, just makes sense to go ahead and install those right now. After torquing each of those to spec, then I reinserted the ignition coil and the bolt that holds it down. So it's a 10 millimeter bolt and 66 inch-pounds of torque. I won't go through removing each of these. I think you get the picture. Here I'm just putting the coils in after the spark plug, and now we're buttoning everything back up. So just reattaching all of these clips, reinstalling the airbox and the ventilation hoses. And at this point, the passenger side is done. The passenger side's the easier side. However, fortunately, pretty much everything that I just did on this side is going to apply on the driver's side. The main difference is that there are a lot more hoses that we need to get out of the way and a few extra little pieces to take off. The good news is that all of the concepts from the passenger side are going to apply here. So I'll spend this time to highlight a couple of the key differences and give you guys a couple notes to hopefully make this side a little bit easier. The first thing I'm highlighting here are all the nuts that need to come off for the various brackets to loosen the fuel lines and some of the ground wires and other wires going through here. There's also one large bolt across the top that was out of that previous shot. Go ahead and take that off as well, and you'll see that's giving a lot of slack to the fuel lines there. Once you have all of these loosened, you're in pretty good shape to be able to remove the valve cover. There are just two more tricky spots that I'll call out here. For me, the rear ignition coil was impossible to remove without loosening this bracket on the AC line here. By removing it, you should have just enough room to be able to maneuver that ignition coil out and change the spark plug if you're also doing that. So here I am with that bracket loosened, and I had to turn the ignition coil about 90 degrees just to get it at the right angle to be able to maneuver it around the AC line there. So with a little bit of patience and maneuvering, I was finally able to get that last ignition coil out. And finally, the last thing I'll highlight here is you actually need to go through the wheel well in order to reach some of the bolts. I tried a few different ways with different extensions, and I just could not get a good angle on them. However, after getting this out of the way, you'll see that you have a clear line of sight to that very rear bolt, and it made removing the center two bolts easier as well. And that's it in terms of unique steps for the driver's side. Everything else is going to be the same as what we've already covered. I would say it just takes a bit more patience and maneuvering on this side. I actually ended up splitting the job up into 2 days just so I could have a fresh start on this side, knowing that it was going to take a bit longer. And that's it for me, guys. I hope you found this video helpful. If you have any tips or tricks, please feel free to leave those in the comments. I know people find those helpful. And otherwise, I'll see you guys next time.